Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I will share my time with the member from Chilliwack Hope. Today, I rise to speak on Bill C-91, the Indigenous Languages Act. It is a bill which would, among other things, establish the Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages, an office which would have the purpose of strengthening and supporting Indigenous languages across this country. Indigenous languages and cultures are numerous and diverse around Canada, and they form part of our great multicultural mosaic, Madam Speaker, which certainly exists throughout this country. UNESCO has launched actually a website devoted entirely to the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And let me quote in part, if you don't mind, from the home page, where it says, "Languages play a crucial role in the daily lives of people, not only as a tool for communication, for education, social integration and development, but also as a repository for each person's unique identity, cultural history, traditions, and memory." Data, of course, from the census from 2016 shows that over 70 Indigenous languages are spoken throughout this country, more like probably over 90, and it represents about 260,000 people in this country. These languages reflect unique and rich Indigenous cultural heritages, which should be valued by all members of Canadian society. However, under the horrific and brutal system of the residential schools, the Canadian government pursued a policy in which the teaching and passing on of Indigenous languages from one generation to the next was stamped out, and community knowledge of Indigenous languages was severely harmed as a result of this shameful policy. Back in 2008, Madam Speaker, on behalf of the Government of Canada, our former Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized to the former students of residential schools and acknowledged the terrible harms that were inflicted upon the Indigenous peoples of Canada through this system, stating that, and at the time, the government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential school policy were profoundly negative, and that this policy has had a lasting and damaging impact on Aboriginal culture, heritage, and language. Our previous Conservative government recognized the damage that residential schools inflicted upon Indigenous communities and Indigenous culture heritage. The effects on Indigenous languages were devastating, as we now know. But our former Conservative government chose to work towards a better future alongside the Indigenous peoples of Canada by launching the Truth and Reconciliation Commission back in 2008. There is much work that certainly needs to be done to support the strengthening and revitalization of Indigenous languages, and Conservatives remain committed in supporting the work of Indigenous communities to protect and reclaim Indigenous languages. The protection of Indigenous languages is valuable to all Canadians. We all know that as part of our shared Canadian heritage, and Conservatives recognize the inherent value that comes from the preservation of rich and diverse Indigenous languages and cultures. However, Madam Speaker, this Liberal government seems to have introduced the legislation as if it was an afterthought. The Prime Minister promised legislation back in 2016. That's almost 2.5 years ago. And now, with only 12 or 13 weeks left in the current parliamentary session, he decides to table it. He sat on this promise for over 2.5 years. During all that time, no such legislation was introduced. Unfortunately, this is a tactic that is common for this Liberal government, which promises much, but yet fails to deliver. Time and time again, the Liberals have failed in their commitments to Indigenous communities across this country by constantly adding to the list of their broken promises. Last February, the Prime Minister made a promise in the House of Commons to pursue a new legal framework which would give greater recognition to Indigenous rights. He said that, and I will quote, "We need to get a place where Indigenous peoples in Canada are in control of their own destiny, making their own decisions about their future," end of quote. And yet, not even a year later after making the promise, standing on the floor of the House of Commons, the Prime Minister himself, standing before the Assembly of First Nations, having to apologize for his Liberal government's utter failure to meet its duty to consult with First Nations over the Trans Mountain Expansion project. Of course, as we all know right now, Madam Speaker, this Liberal government has no plans at all to move forward with any legislation before the next election, which would implement the legal framework that the Prime Minister promised to Indigenous communities just last year. Now, these broken promises to Indigenous peoples are not only irresponsible, they are very harmful as well. Speaking on the failure of this Liberal government to introduce its promised legal framework before the next election, Mary Ellen Turple-Lafond, she was formerly of Saskatchewan, but now is the director of the University of British Columbia's Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center. She stated that promising people transformative change and failing is not only disturbing, it is downright inhumane. It is the kind of pain and trauma that just gets compounded. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, this Liberal government has a long record of making promises to Indigenous communities across this country only to break those promises as soon as they're made. You know, I'm going to share some interesting and encouraging facts on Indigenous languages from my own province of Saskatchewan, my own city of Saskatoon, and my own riding of Saskatoon-Grasswood. So before I became a member of Parliament, I served for 9.5 years as a trustee on the Saskatoon Board of Education. And at that time, Madam Speaker, we certainly celebrated Indigenous language around our board table. I was proud to be involved in the expansion of Indigenous language training program in Saskatoon-Grasswood. You know, in my riding, Madam Speaker, many students are fortunate today to participate in Indigenous language instruction. I'm going to name a few schools here, starting first with Confederation Park Community School. They offer language instruction in Cree, and about 280 students from pre-K all the way up to grade 8 are involved. These students benefit from the Nehuwawewin Cree language and cultural program. Over at Westmount Community School, they provide a Métis cultural program that includes Michif, the language instruction for students from pre-K all the way up to grade 8. And at the Charles Red Hawk School, they also offer Cree language instruction from pre-K all the way up to grade 4. And then in our high schools, Mount Royal Collegiate, Princess Alexandra, and even the elementary school of King George all provide Cree language instruction. The Saskatoon Public Schools offer instruction in 3 Indigenous languages, Cree, Michif, along with Dakota. And Dakota language and cultural lessons are part of Chief Whitecap and Charles Red Hawk schools. I should mention Chief Whitecap is a major participation with the Saskatoon Board of Education on a new education formula. Over at St. Francis Cree Bilingual School in my riding of Saskatoon-Grasswood, they offer Cree education to 440 students in pre-K to grade 5, and then another 150 students to grade 6 and 8. Because of the growing demand of Cree bilingual education, St. Francis Cree Bilingual School is now serving students at 2 locations. At the Oskayak High School in my neighboring riding, Cree language instruction is offered to grades 9 to 12, where approximately 70 students are taking Cree language instruction. And Greater Saskatoon Catholic Schools offer core Cree language, Madam Speaker, to some 348 students from pre-K all the way up to grade 8 at St. Mary's Wellness and Education Center. In conclusion, Conservatives will support this bill, Madam Speaker, going forward. and to second reading and stand committed on reviewing this Bill C-91 in committee to ensure that this Liberal government once again lives up to the promises that it has made to all Indigenous peoples of Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker.